My name is Brian Lampkin. I'm one of the founders of Bound Literary Festival. And tonight we're having a chat with Casey Cep, author of Just Furious Hours, Murder, Fraud, and the Last Trial of Harper Lee. And let me tell you, I just love this book, but we'll get to that in just a minute. This is actually the weekend the festival would have been happening here in Greensboro, North Carolina. And we would have had 60 writers in town. And right now we'd be lining up for Billy Collins, who will be our featured Saturday night event. Well, of course, coronavirus had a different idea, but most of the folks we've talked with, want to participate in some way. So we're doing Zoom events. Billy Collins has just agreed to be our feature next May. So the 2021 festival now has Billy Collins attending, and he'll be joined by Leah Green, the winner of the Walt Whitman Award for her book, The More Extravagant Feast. So many great things are happening. I'm going to tell you about our next Zoom event, which is with Emily Nemens, the editor of the Paris Review, author of the new novel Cactus League. So Emily will be Zooming with us on June 5th. And she'll be talking with Alexis Orgara, the editor of Penny Candy Books, here on the Greensboro Bound Zoom network. All right, and then we have many more events coming. We have a prison event coming with Tessie Castillo, author of Crimson Letters. And I'm going to let this slip. We think Sister Helen Prejean is going to join us for that Zoom. How exciting is that? I mean, that is a profound moment. Let's hope that all happens. Sister Helen has back surgery coming. So it's all about the scheduling of her back surgery, but hopefully she'll join us for that event with Tessie Castillo. But tonight we have Casey Cep, who I think your event was going to be tomorrow at the festival. Is that right, Casey? Yeah, Sunday the 17th. We'll take you a day early. The Furious Hours is just a great hybrid. It's a hybrid of literary autobiography of Harper Lee, a true crime story of this, frankly, serial killer, right? I think you even him as a serial killer eventually. And a really interesting lawyer as well. Casey is a graduate of Harvard University, went Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford, where she has a degree in theology. She's a writer at the New Yorker, and I just read a really fascinating piece she did on obituaries, which maybe we'll get to that later on in the conversation, Casey. So, Casey Cep, welcome to the Greensboro Bound Zoom room. Say hello to your fans.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian. I just want to apologize for the background, and I hope the internet is okay. And just want to say it's really great that folks have logged on, and I'm glad that we're still able to be together, but also that everyone's being safe. And I hope it's okay to shout out Scuppernong Books, which is the local indie who's involved in the festival, and who, if we were all in person, I'd be telling you to buy the book there or buy some book there. And so I hope that one of the things that migrates with these online conversations too is support for the brick and mortar stores that put these festivals together and that work with festival organizers. So if you don't know Scuppernong, probably everybody here does, but if you don't, it's a great indie, and I hope you'll take a look at their site, and whatever the next book is you're planning to buy, you'll pick it up from them.
That's great advice, Casey. As owner of Scuppernong Books, I appreciate it.
We weren't going to tell him that was a arranged promotion.
Yeah, all right. Do I have to pay you now? Oh no. Hey, I was telling Casey that I actually met her in Albuquerque, New Mexico a year and a half ago, before her book was published. It was a book conference in Albuquerque, and amazingly enough, I had read the book on the plane to Albuquerque, and I was at one of those crazy book parties, and Casey was there, and I went up to her and said, "Casey, God, I love your book. This is so great." And her really charming response was, "I'm not ready for people to tell me that yet." The book hadn't even come out yet. And it was like this really just sincere, overwhelmed response that I really loved. Are you ready for people to tell you how much they love your book, Casey?
I don't know. I mean, it's still surreal. I'm sure a lot of the people who are listening to our conversation are writers, or they're interested in writing. And I thought that I had a lot of sympathy for Harper Lee before the book came out. And this book has not done anywhere nearly as well as To Kill a Mockingbird, to be clear, but even a fraction of that, I just had another appreciation for what happened in her life. She was 34 years old when she published To Kill a Mockingbird, and I had been publishing articles and profiles and reviews and things before Furious Hours, but Harper Lee had basically published nothing. And she went from nothing to a Pulitzer Prize winning best-selling novel that got adapted into an Oscar-winning film. And I just think the last year and a half has given me some sense of just how tremendously overwhelmed she was. And when Furious Hours came out, I kind of immediately had other deadlines, and I write for the New Yorker, so I feel like I live on deadline, and there's always this short piece I'm trying to finish up. And I started to realize kind of what happened for Harper Lee, which is once that book came out, everyone instantly wondered what she would do next and what the next book would be. And I just feel like I have a lot more sympathy for the expectation and the pressure that really just closed in on her after that. And I just think when you write something, you feel lucky if your mother will read it, much less people around the country. And so I'm no more prepared for it, but it is awfully nice to be able to talk to people about a story you've thought so much about and about characters you've thought so much about. And I feel like when I do these, I often just learn from people. They notice something I didn't, or they have some other theory of what happened, or they cross paths with Harper Lee, so they have something else to contribute to her story. So I'm still not ready for compliments, but there's another aspect of it which I enjoy, and that's just the conversation.
Your respect and even love of Harper Lee is clear, but it's not an easy story you tell about Harper Lee. At times, it's quite sad. Have you had pushback on that from the Harper Lee mafia, if you will?
Well, I don't know about the Harper Lee mafia, but it's funny. I used to joke when I was working on the book that there was a kind of omerta of Harper Lee, and there was this sense, like in the mafia, that you didn't talk about Harper Lee, and if you knew her, the people who talked about her didn't know her well. And that there was a lot of resistance at the beginning of getting her friends and family to share their stories, or to really open up about things that they'd been so private and protective of during her lifetime. So that was something to work through in the reporting. And the truth is, because I had met so many of them and talked to them and interviewed them, there wasn't pushback once the book came out. They all kind of knew what I was up to, and they knew how thoroughly I'd researched it. And I think that some of the things that are hard for us as fans of hers to read about and to think about, the reality is her friends and family lived it. They knew that she struggled with depression, and they knew that she had a drinking problem, and they knew all of the things that she kept so private. So there hasn't been pushback so much. There's been some rewarding conversations really with people who did know her and who were just happy to know about other parts of her life that were more fulfilling, or other friendships where they worried she was lonely in New York to learn about people she knew there, or people in New York who always wondered how close or not close she was with her family in Alabama. They enjoyed learning about that part of her life. So it's been mostly fine. I know what you mean, though. For me personally, I have always loved her work, and I was interested in her life. And I really wanted this to be the kind of like mystery reporting experience that ended with me finding, the 10 manuscripts Harper Lee never published. And I would wake up every day. I love treasure hunts. I just woke up every day thinking, today's the day someone's going to hand me the Reverend, and they're going to have all this juvenilia of hers. And so I think just for me as a writer, I put off writing the end of the book for a very long time, and I wanted to remain open to the possibility that it ended differently, that there was this body of work we hadn't seen, and maybe more books like Watchmen that could be published. So I think even more than there's pushback from other people, there was kind of my own emotional resistance to really finishing the book and putting the final chapter on her life. And I think that's been rewarding too. I've done some events in Alabama, and people have walked up to me with copies of letters from her, or they've shared stories of something else they knew she was working on. So it's nice to know that it's it was an ending for the sake of the book, but it's not the end of things we'll learn about her. And more and more of her letters have come out, especially. But I think there's probably more emotional drama for me than a lot of people in her life. They knew all this. They lived it. They made their peace with it a long time ago.
Yeah. And for those who haven't read the book, your book is only 1/3 Harper Lee. There's at least two other fascinating characters in this book. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the Reverend and about Alabama and about your John McPhee opening. And
Well, that's very charming. That's a high compliment. I like to think it's kind of like the poor man's John McPhee. What Brian is talking about is, for those who haven't read it, the kind of first chapter of the book is about this hydroelectric power project that took place in the area where all these murders took place. And the book opens there because it felt really important to me to situate us all in a place, in a time. And that place is, Eastern Alabama, and that time is in the 1920s. And the most important thing happening there was the changing of the Tallapoosa River watershed and the installation of the Martin Dam and the flooding of Lake Martin. So it's this man-made lake, and I loved getting to write about it. And that's the entree into the story of the Reverend Willie Maxwell. And it's important because that's where he was born and raised, and that hydroelectric power project is what changed the industry in the area, so that when he came back from his Army service, he got a job at a mechanized textile mill. And, instead of just living his life as a sharecropper, he had some opportunity within the kind of industrial mill space. So that's why it opens that way. And it's true that, I sometimes apologize for this, but if you're in it for Harper Lee, I always say you have to be patient because she shows up on the first page of the book, but it's true that she doesn't come back until the last third of the book. And so we do spend time at the beginning with Willie Maxwell, who was a itinerant preacher. And, I mentioned he worked for a textile mill. He did a lot of things to make a living. But at a certain point in his career, some people would have you believe that what he started to do was kill friends and family for the insurance money. And so he was accused of killing 5 of his family members. And the second part of the book is about the lawyer who represented him in all of those legal scuffles over those deaths and those murder investigations and all of the civil trials that followed it, because there was a tremendous amount of litigation about the life insurance that he was collecting on all those people. So the first third of the book is the alleged serial killer. The second third is his lawyer. And then we meet Harper Lee, who got interested in this story and wanted to write her own book about it. So that's kind of the structure, and it is built around the biographies of these 3 people. And, they do meet, they do cross paths, but they're also, what's interesting to me is they're just 3 very different lives from small town Alabama. And I think they bring to life, for me at least, a lot of the changes in the 20th century and a lot of the variable opportunities depending on your gender or your race or your socioeconomic status when you started out. So that's, to me, they work really well in conversation with one another.
It's funny, you talk about situating it in time. When I read that first chapter, I always have to keep reminding myself, this is the 1970s. It always feels like I'm back in the 1930s or something. And I know it's got a lot to do with racism in America and poverty, but I don't know if you have this sense of it, but it was very interesting for me to have to keep reminding myself, no, this is 1970s America.
Yeah, and I'll see what kind of questions people have, but I'll just say from my perspective as a writer, the very first draft of the opening of the book felt too untethered in time. And I, like you, thought, it reads like a ghost story. It reads like something that's fictional. And one of the my editor did very little editing in the sense of like structure or changes like that. But he did write to me and say, I think you should tell us what was on TV. And I think you should tell us, give us the presidency and that sort of thing. The second part of the book is really grounded in contemporary politics, so you don't need to do that. But those first couple chapters, I think my editor kind of rightfully said, like, this could be a horror story from the 19th century. And it's true that this part of Alabama, Coosa County is one of the most rural counties in all of Alabama. It's truly underdeveloped and undeveloped, and there's a very much still an agrarian way of life there. And so even the industries, when we start to talk about them, feel kind of antiquated. So that for me was a challenge. You didn't want it to turn into a Wikipedia article where it's hyperlinked with every single date reference and, point of time, or add like a chronology. But every so often sprinkling in things that would remind people what year it is and where we are and the chronology of what's happening. So I think it's a challenge. I mean, God bless John McPhee. I just have to walk you through this hydroelectric power project that started in the 1920s. You know, John McPhee as a writer is often like taking us back to the dinosaurs and then bringing us forward to 1990. And it's hard to move through time when you're a writer. And, you know, I think there's a chapter of this book that like some people love and some people hate. And it's about the history of life insurance, because I told you the Reverend was making all this money off life insurance. But I take you back to the Great Fire and the earthquake at Lisbon, and you know, we really do go back in time. And I think for some people, they're like, I don't need it. You know, I just want the life insurance fraud in Alabama at the time of this serial killer. But I love history, so it was fun to go back.
No, I love that. That's great. I wanted to ask you, and I apologize to all the other people out there for this private question. Did you read Blessed Assurances by Alan Gurganus ever? Do you know that
No, I don't.
novella? It's a novella about insurance salesmen in Black communities in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Just
No, I wish this is like where you're like, gosh, I wish we'd cross paths before the book was done.
yeah.
Crazily enough, the book that was, I mean, there are a bunch of histories I read that are really useful, but Philip Roth's father was a debit salesman, sold life insurance in poor Black communities in Newark. And in Philip Roth's memoir of his father, he talks about that job and how it worked and how he came to terms with the exploitative nature of these policies. Because, you know, not to turn this into a conversation about life insurance, but it's true that the Reverend was committing insurance fraud and that, you know, in all likelihood, he committed murders in order to collect on the policies. But it's also true that at this point in time, the life insurance industry was tremendously exploitative of Black clients. And they preyed on Black families and they charged higher premiums and they gave them lower payouts. And, you know, there was just truly a segregated system for life insurance in this country. And so much so that eventually when those cases were settled, these were billion-dollar settlements to finally restore to Black families what they were owed. But I didn't know about the Gurganus. I can't wait to look it up. I'm now obsessed with life insurance, and I can't wait to find it. It's truly my most recent life insurance fact was we're not so far from, hopefully this is like a South Carolinian crowd, we're not so far from Tennessee, and I'd never known why Music City was called Music City. You know why how Nashville got the name, how country music is based there? Well, there was a life insurance company in Nashville that decided they would start a radio station just so they could advertise themselves. And, you know, they subsidized the network and the radio waves and put up the antenna. And eventually it was so big it went coast to coast. And so Nashville improbably became the seat of recording because one life insurance company decided it wasn't enough to advertise in print. They wanted to advertise on the radio. So life insurance really is a way to look at the history of the world. And I simply refuse to believe that it's boring. Whoever said it was boring was just completely wrong about it.
I think you're right. Hey, I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for people to jump in on chat. So yeah, all you people out there, just type in a question into the chat room, and then I'll read it off to Casey. But I do want to talk about Tom Radney a little bit, who's the second third of the book. And boy, it's so interesting, the racial politics of Alabama, this liberal Democrat who nevertheless kind of preys on the Black community a little bit. I just talk about this complicated character for a little bit, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom Radney is a really interesting man, and you know, he was, other than Harper Lee, my first foray into this story. And I had been looking for people. I started this book after Go Set a Watchman came out, and I went down to Alabama and I was writing a story about allegations about Harper Lee's ability to consent to publication. And you know, there were all these rumors and there was all this innuendo about the lawyer who was in charge of her affairs and, you know, what had happened to Harper Lee. And in the course of reporting that, I asked to talk to anybody who had dealt with Harper Lee's lawyer. And I got put in touch with the Radney family. And the Radneys, you know, had this wonderful story about how Harper Lee had come to Alexander City, the town where they lived, to try and write a book. And, you know, you nod along and you think, okay, she was trying to write a book. And they said, well, it was a true crime book about a murderous voodoo preacher who got murdered at his funeral. And, you know, Tom, this is, so some of them their husband, some of them their father, some of them their grandfather. So I'm talking to the granddaughter and she says, you know, granddaddy defended the Reverend and then he defended the guy who shot him. and Harper Lee was going to write a book about it. And, sometimes you really think people are pulling your leg and you say like, you mean, wait, what do you mean? And of course she meant it. And Tom Radney, the moment he found out Harper Lee was interested, he seized the opportunity and he thought that, it was for him the case of a lifetime. And he had had this thwarted political career and he had been interested in, prominence and fame and establishing himself. And this was kind of a last ditch opportunity. Harper Lee telling his story, he thought would be a way to do that. And so he's a tremendously interesting character, and he was before Harper Lee walked into town, and he was the whole time she was working on this book. And I think there were real tensions right away between how he saw himself as the hero of the story and how she imagined the narrative version of it. So, I think it's an interesting problem for a writer. There's always a potential hero, there are always potential villains, and you make a lot of choices about how to depict people. And I think that Harper Lee was really struggling with someone who was heroic, but maybe not a hero. And, Tom is an interesting candidate. He's narratively important to the story, but as you mentioned, some people in town did not find him heroic. And defending the Reverend when he was accused of one murder was one thing, but defending the Reverend over and over and over again and helping him to stay out of prison and making a tremendous amount of money off the life insurance policies in each of these cases. I tell this story in the book, but when Tom Radney built a new law office, people in Alexander City called it the Maxwell House because it was the house that Maxwell built. The money from all these life insurance cases went into the property. And so, it was mixed reputation, and yet he was also just a tremendously likable guy, larger than life figure, a do-gooder. He'd been active in every civic club in the county. He'd been a statewide politician, so he was well known. And I think those are some of the tensions Harper Lee was wrestling with. And if you've read Go Set a Watchman and you've read To Kill a Mockingbird, you know that she was interested in white allies and in what stories we can tell about civil rights and the fight for justice and who gets to tell them and who's scrutinized for their involvement. So I think, she met her match with Tom, and some of the letters she wrote at the time about his interests and his encouragement and his persistence in trying to get her to write the book are really interesting. And I think, he is an interesting character, and I think his legacy only got more interesting as the state of Alabama changed over the years too. So I loved getting to know the Radneys and getting to think about Tom's life. And, I think he's a divisive figure. He was in this story, and he's continued to be in the book. But almost always, if I get asked about Tom, I talk about kind of his last letter to the editor of the local newspaper. And, Tom died in 2011, but before he died, he was still writing letters to the editor defending Barack Obama and defending liberalism in the South. And, I think that in some ways, time got ahead of him, but in other ways, he lived long enough to catch up. And when you look at his politics and you look at the message, he was trying to get people to pay higher taxes. He was trying to get people to understand how legal integration could be helpful and successful and improve the lives of all communities in Alabama. He was not marching with Martin Luther King, but he still had very progressive ideas about the world. And so I think it's just, he's a very human guy, and I love getting to write about him, and I love getting to look at how someone like that wrestles with their own legacy and makes sense of the world. He lived a tremendously long time, and lived through various periods of Alabama's history and of the Democratic Party. So he's a really interesting guy, and for me is the kind of hinge, because if there were no Tom Radney, probably Harper Lee would never have found out about the Reverend. He's the hinge between the two parts of the book, and he was a tremendously good friend to her and tried to encourage her. And I think when a lot of other people had given up on her, not only with her book about the Reverend Maxwell, but about her career in general, I think Tom was still an optimist. And in a lot of ways, he was one of the only people who thought she still had a book in her.
Nice. Well, I'm glad you're talking about Alabama. Our first question from the crowd is, while doing research in Alabama, what are some of the things that surprised you about Alabama? And what were your biggest surprises in regards to the entire story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it gives me the chance to say something more about that opening, Brian, that you and I were talking about. When I first went to Alexander City, Lake Martin was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. And I had no idea. When I thought of Alabama, I thought of Birmingham and Montgomery. I thought of these industrial cities, and I thought of the downtowns, and I thought of the marches, but I didn't think about this beautiful, bucolic, outdoor wonderland. And
Mhm.
Alabama has beautiful rolling hills and beautiful pine forests. And when I looked at Lake Martin, it was fascinating to me to learn the history of how it was made and how it changed the Tallapoosa River. And I thought right away, this is one of the most beautiful parts of the country I've ever seen. And it made me want to write about the natural landscape and bring it to life, because I don't think I'm alone in underestimating the kind of natural beauty. I mean, if you've never been to Talladega Forest, you have no idea just how gorgeous the state of Alabama is. So that was one of the things that surprised me. And I was lucky enough, because I had so much time to work on the book. I rented a house on Lake Martin a couple of times and could really spend time down there and got to admire the landscape. And I guess, but the question of like what surprised me most, my very first Sunday in town in Alexander City, not in Monroeville. Harper Lee was born and raised in Monroeville, but this all takes place up in Alexander City. And my first Sunday in Alexander City, I think I was prepared to go to church with the Baptists and the Methodists. But my very first Sunday in Alexander City, I went to the Mormon church with a source of mine. And right away you realize how you've underestimated the diversity of Alabama when there's a Mormon stake in Alexander City. And it was wonderful. This was a woman who had found a letter from Harper Lee, and she was interested in genealogy. And so she had done a lot of work investigating the case on her own. And, we had gone to lunch and I had interviewed her by phone, but I went to, Mormon church my first Sunday there. So I think kind of over and over again, people just surprised me. And I got to know just a lot of different lives there. It is like anywhere else in this country, full of interesting people, some from there, some who've moved there, some who hope to move away, some who never want to leave. And just nice to be able to spend time getting to know them. And that's just another thing I'd be remiss if I didn't say, I am so grateful to all the people who just took time to talk to me. And whether that was like a lunch at the Huddle House where they told me their family's history, or an afternoon at the library where we went digging through old newspaper clips and they were telling me about so and so and where so and so lived, or people who had moved to Atlanta but who would go to lunch with me to talk about this case. And so it wasn't surprising, but I was over and over again grateful for how generous people were with their time and their stories. And for some people, really painful family stories, things that they didn't want to talk about. I said Tom Radney was a complicated figure, but not everybody in this book is heroic. And when it came to Harper Lee, even though she's a very beloved national figure, sitting at a Panera to talk about her drinking habit is not something a lot of people who love her necessarily want to do. So I'm very grateful.
So that's great, Casey, because the next question addresses that. The person wants to know why this book? Why did you want to write this book? And then what was the most difficult part of it? And maybe telling secrets is one of those.
Yeah, although I'm like a lot of people, I love to tell secrets and I love gossip. So you gotta do it, politely. And when it comes to lawyers, you gotta do it in a way that's not, litigatable. But no, why this book? I mean, I loved Harper Lee. I loved To Kill a Mockingbird. I read it when I was quite young. Actually, my mother read it to me the first time, and then I read it over and over again. And I had always wanted to see where she was from. Monroeville is kind of a one-to-one model for Macomb, and I had wanted to see it, and I got the chance to go down there to work on a story about Ghost at a Watchman. And I liked Alabama so much, I wanted to keep coming back, and I wanted to know more about her life. And it seemed like an interesting moment because so many people who had not wanted to talk about her were suddenly willing to. And that was even more true after she passed. So I love writing, and I had been doing a lot of freelance journalism, and I was kind of looking for the right book idea, and I'd had a lot of bad ones. But this one seemed interesting, and it seemed like, you called it a hybrid earlier, and I think that's a very complimentary word for it, but it's really a lot of different genres and a lot of different kinds of stories, and that was appealing to me because I thought I wouldn't get bored. And as for challenges, all three of these stories are tricky for different reasons, and it has to do with how much archival material there is, or how many people were willing to talk about it, and just challenging in different ways, but rewarding too. I really felt like they worked together, and the work of getting to know these three people pays off because you learn so much more about each of them by comparing them to each other.
Nice. I know you wrote that early article at the end, you said, someone should write about this story. And then you realized, oh, that someone should be me, right?
I mean, I'll tell you, for the folks who are, chatting with us who are writers, you should try and know your own self as a writer, but you should also really listen to your friends and listen to people who care about your career, because the truth is, it's true, the end of that article said someone should write a book about this, and I didn't really think much about it. I just thought, well, that's a nice ending to the story. And it was certainly true that over and over again, people I interviewed said, being Harper Lee didn't write it, someone should. But actually, there's a writer I really admire, Philip Gurevich. And Philip is a tremendous reporter. He wrote a book about Rwanda that, if folks haven't read it, it's just one of the most morally serious and important books I've ever read. And I don't know anything about Rwanda, but I read it and learned so much, and learned about forgiveness and genocide and violence in a way I had never before. Anyway, I'm a huge admirer of Philip's, and Philip wrote to me after that piece and he said, "You dummy, you should write it." And so, I was like, yeah, why not? I am interested in this. I do like the South. I do admire Harper Lee. This does feel like a great story, but yeah, it was really thanks to some other people who pointed out that was true. And so I think it's really important to listen to the people who care about you and who are thinking about you. And, they often have good ideas and ideas you don't see clearly. And just let them speak to you. Have mentors and, people who really do want to encourage you as a writer, or whatever you do, as a teacher, as a parent, listen to people who tell you things you do well or things you could do better, because especially when it's coming from people who love you, it's often good advice. And in this case, it really was good advice.
Nice. Okay. Can you talk about any intersection Truman Capote had in your work?
Oh, yeah. This is a real, whoever asked that, thanks a lot. I don't know how I ever managed to leave him out. Truman Capote was one of my favorite parts of this book. And I knew that Capote and Lee had grown up together, and probably anybody who knows anything about Harper Lee knows that Truman Capote was a neighbor of hers as a child. He wasn't born in Alabama, but his mother had some relatives who lived right in Monroeville, right next door to the Lee family. And so, almost from conception, Capote is the, odd fellow to Harper Lee. And they are the true comedy duo. And at any moment in their lives, they're kind of crossing paths. And, they were tremendously competitive as children. They wrote stories together and they tried to write better stories than the other. And, they fought with other children and protected one another from other children. And probably folks know that he was the model for Dill in To Kill a Mockingbird. So you get a sense of his character and hers from Scout, but that remained true for the rest of their lives. When she moved to New York, he was already living there, and he tried to get her set up. He was supposed to get her a job at Mademoiselle. Carson McCullers had a relative who was an editor at Mademoiselle, but that job fell through, and so Harper Lee had to get a different one. But, Capote was there, and he made social introductions. And then, probably most consequentially for my book, when he went out to Kansas to work on In Cold Blood, he wanted to take a different friend who couldn't go, and so he took Harper Lee. And, she was armed with a law school education and with an intellectual curiosity for crime, and with a common man's demeanor that just actually allowed him to report that book. There are people today who still swear they would never have talked to Truman Capote, but they felt comfortable with Harper Lee, and they felt that she was sincerely interested in their lives, and they were willing to share their story with her, not with him. And, for folks who, if you ever go to New York, one of the things you can do up there is go to the New York Public Library, and you can look at the notes that she made for Capote. And they're tremendously thorough, they're tremendously intelligent, and it's really thanks to her that he had all the material he needed for the book. And it's interesting, I mean, that's basically what she did, was that same method, that same style of reporting when she came to Alexander City. So Capote, is really, he's not just the kind of social butterfly flitting through her story, introducing her to people, one-upping her with others, trying to win more awards than the other, trying to sell more copies than the other. But really, it's intellectually, he plays a role in her life by giving her the model with In Cold Blood And it was a kind of apprenticeship for her that she then tried to do again in Alexander City. Nice. It's a great question. Yeah. We should all be so lucky to have that kind of coincidence of geography, that like your earliest friend turns out to just be, you know, a professional soulmate of sorts.
Okay. Your Oxford degree in theology, was that a detour or a core part of your journey as a writer?
That is a great question, and probably one that someone else could answer better than I could. So I studied theology when I was there, and I actually studied Christian ethics. And I think if nothing else, I read a tremendous amount of very well argued, well written theology and philosophy. And that was extremely useful to me as a writer, because it taught me how to make an intellectually serious argument, and it taught me about a robust tradition within one kind of discourse. And I think in some really straightforward ways made me think about what writing can do and the kinds of arguments it can make and how it can speak to a narrow audience or a broad one. That was all very useful. The detour, as it were, I think that might be defensible as a kind of analog to journalism school, but the detour was, for a little while I thought I wanted to be a minister, and I actually looked into ordination in the Lutheran Church. And I think what's funny about Furious Hours is, you know, there are a lot of candidates for heroes in the book, but there's kind of one villain, and he's a man of the cloth. And so the ministers in my life were really just like, it's not enough you didn't go into ministry, you had to like promote this like bad boy reverend. And so they're really hoping I'll focus more on, you know, upright, you know, morally righteous, you know, clergy people who can be an example and, you know, a beacon of the church, because this was really kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel for what a minister can do or should do. But I don't think anything in life is a detour. You know, we're all trying to figure out who we are, and you learn something from whatever you do. And it's certainly true that a lot of what I read at Oxford has shaped the kinds of things I write about and the ways that I write about them. And for me, Furious Hours was just such a perfect book, because I love religion, I love politics, and I love literature. And I think that those are three of the main ways of looking at the world and making sense of it. And I like that these three characters put those worldviews in conversation with one another, and really let you see the kinds of ways we can organize our lives and our society, and the way we can make sense of them. So I would like to think there's kind of no detour in life. And the truth is, if nothing else, Oxford is one of the most beautiful places I have ever, you know, traveled or sat on the lawn and read. And you know, nobody could call it a detour to read all of Austin and all of Lewis. And I just did a lot of reading while I was there, and I'm grateful for the chance to have done it.
Hey, there's a question here. How does Willie Maxwell become a reverend? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for a long time, early in my reporting, people told me that he was self-ordained, and that's obviously not uncommon in the Baptist church, particularly missionary Baptist. But it actually turns out, I mean, he was ordained in a church, and I was able to find a record of the ordination. And even more interestingly, even though Willie Maxwell had only a few years of formal education, he then did a kind of, I guess you'd call it a continuing education degree at a theological school in Montgomery. So I tell this story in the book, but kind of crazily, there was a moment in time where in the basement of one of the churches where Martin Luther King preached, and where the bus boycott in Montgomery was strategized, Willie Maxwell was sitting in the basement learning about theology. And he was finally getting a kind of formal education. And so that's how. And you know, the funny thing about Willie Maxwell, and this is one of the reasons I wanted him to have his own distinct section of the book, there was quite a lot of his life before he was ever accused of a crime. And a lot of his life was spent actually just preaching the gospel and working hard at the job at the mill and working hard at a job at a rock quarry. And, you know, frankly, he was very highly regarded in the community. And the preaching was legendary, and he was notorious for his preaching and ability to recall scripture and the kind of air with which he conducted himself. And so it's one of the things that I think that drew Harper Lee to him as a character. You know, what made him change, what made him turn, and frankly, you know, the kind of incommensurability between that part of his life and then what he became even more notorious for. So it's a great question. And, you know, there's a little bit of a riff in the book about kind of revival culture and what was going on in Alabama at the time. And just a tremendous, it wasn't quite the Great Awakening, but this was a tremendous period of religiosity in the South and around the country. This was really Alabama. It's like an incredible statistic in the book. It's like 1 in 4 Alabamians were Baptist. It was really just a resurgence of Christianity in this part of the world at this particular moment. And he was part of it. All these bivocational men who just were passionate about Jesus. And even if they couldn't make a living preaching, they did it on the side of a bunch of other jobs.
All right, Casey, this has been a great 45-minute conversation, and we're really appreciative of your time. I do want to end with an important question. Harper Lee's whole life is consumed by the second book. What is that second book going to be? So let's ask Casey Cep. What is that next book? Are you working on something?
Yeah. Well, I'll just tell you, there's a little riff in the book about one-hit wonders. And, I think we associate that with musicians, and we talk about, someone who had one big song and then we never heard from them again. And with Harper Lee, I wondered for a while when people started to wonder about her second book. Was it 5 years? Was it 10 years? At what point, were there stories of like, when's Harper Lee going to write another book? And it turns out it was probably the day To Kill a Mockingbird came out, because in my experience, the day Furious Hours came out, people started to say, what's your second book about? I have a million. Yeah, I'll tell you, I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for Harper Lee, and I think, look, first of all, she was a better writer than I am, so this is understandable. She was a more tortured writer than I am, and I think that, I talk about this in the book, but she had a lot of emotional issues around writing, and some of that was because of what happened with To Kill a Mockingbird, and some of it just was a kind of seriousness about her work and a philosophy about art and suffering, and it's not one I hold. And so I'm a very happy writer, and I've written a ton of stuff for the New Yorker since the book came out. And I think, though, probably what I'm hoping to have be book 2 is a story about a shipwreck, and it's a little like Furious Hours in that there's a kind of A plot, as it were. There's the story of the ship when it sank, and it's an old Spanish galleon, and then there's a kind of B plot about when it was found and the fight over the treasure when it was recovered. But I'm hoping that's book 2. But yeah, it won't take me as long as it took Harper Lee, but it also will take me longer than this.
Nice. Everyone out there, read Casey's work in the New Yorker. It's amazing. The most recent piece on obituaries is stunning in consideration of our times, and especially in New York City. And buy her book, Furious Hours. You don't have to buy it at Scuppernong. At Scuppernong. But it's so good. I just love this book. I'm so grateful for your time. We missed the Greensboro Bound Literary Festival, but I know we'll see you in Greensboro someday for that next book, maybe. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Casey, any last comments?
No, I'll just say one other thing, since we're telling people, where to spend their money and how to spend their time. That obituaries piece was really heartbreaking to write, and it's about the effort to memorialize, at this point, more than 80,000 people who have died of COVID. But I will say, I couldn't have written my book without local newspapers. When I was going back to try and reconstruct the story of Alexander City in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 70s, you need the local newspapers to do it. And in particular, the reason I was so interested in obituaries is often my way of tracking down someone who knew Harper Lee or who played a role in the Maxwell case was, if they were dead, I could find their obituary and figure out their survivors and track them down and have a conversation. And it is simply true that, if you're not subscribing to your local paper and you're not, spending money where it counts, we won't have these institutions. And whether it's Scuppernong or the local paper, we have all got to do what we can to support those institutions. And I normally don't get on a horse that's very high, but this is one I feel like I won't fall off. And that obituary piece just really brought to mind for me how impossible my book would have been without a local paper. And Harper Lee got to know those writers, and they helped her with her book. And the same thing happened out in Kansas with Capote, and the reporters who helped him and the writers who helped him. And so I know it's a tough time, and I know that there are a lot of demands on our dollars, but we've got to spend the money locally, and we've got to support the institutions that sustain us. So that's it. And I promise I won't turn this into a sermon, but it's on my mind because of that obituary piece. It really is that my heart just breaks to think on the other side of this, we'll lose the stores and the papers and the magazines that really make our lives rich and that document them for the next generation.
That's a beautiful way to end. Thank you, Casey Cep. We really appreciate you. And we'll see you again. Thank you. Join us for Emily Nemens on June 5th and read her great book, The Cactus League, read the Paris Review, and pick up your Greensboro News and Record tomorrow. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much.